Okay, we're recording. I don't remember how many people said there's some people that have said they wouldn't be here today. So I'll be recording. And there's some announcements. I'm gonna save those till the end because it's pretty important to make sure everybody gets the announcement. So we're gonna keep continuing with reproductive anatomy, and then just all this whole section, it all goes in order and all the topics kind of merge into each other. So we will get to some fetal development today. We'll be a little bit behind in the slides, but it will all just kind of continue together. So last time when we stopped, we had been looking at the erectile chambers in the penis, which have a name, corpus something. So we've got corpus cavernosum, there are two of those. Corpus spongiosum, there's one of those, and that surrounds the urethra. And the purpose of these chambers is to be able to fill with blood and then cause erection. And the way that that works is the arteries have to dilate. So when the arteries dilate, more blood is in the area and it pushes on veins hard enough that the blood does not flow back out. So that's generally how the erection process works. You have to have dilation of the arteries and enough blood inflow to compress the veins. And those corpus spongiosum and corpus cavernosum enable that. So that process physiologically is kind of complicated, and a lot has to go right for this to happen. So it involves sympathetic nervous system activation for climax, but it involves parasympathetic for erection. So both of those systems have to be working properly. If men don't have good blood flow generally, if they have hormonal imbalances, or if they have mental health struggles, those affect this process. So those of you that are going into counseling or psychology, malfunctions in this system can come from mental health struggles, and malfunctions in this system can contribute to mental health troubles as well. So a lot has to go right physiologically for male sexual response to work well, I would say. Not just I would say, research says. So that kind of finishes up male anatomy, and we'll start now on the female anatomy. And we've got here a frontal section looking from the front, and we're going to start with ovaries. So kind of like in male reproductive system, we start with the testis because that's the important part. And then we follow the path of the sperm out. We're going to do the same with female reproductive system. So we start with ovaries. And the ovaries are most important because they produce eggs, which can also be called oocytes, or you might hear some people call these oocytes. Oocytes, I'm not going to say it. They are the eggs, and you need ovaries to produce those. You have cells in the ovaries that can do meiosis and can produce eggs or mature oocytes that have 23 chromosomes. And we've got that on here. They have 23 chromosomes. They're coming from originator cells that have 46 chromosomes. So in the female body, really the only place in the female body that meiosis can happen is in ovaries. As opposed to males that can make 250 million sperm on a weekly basis, females, when you're born, you have about 200,000 primary oocytes. And that can also be called ovarian reserve. So there's this terminology, ovarian reserve, that means how many eggs do you have left? And nobody cares about that until they start running out or start deteriorating. And they kind of, the most important thing on this picture is this line right here. So the oocytes will start going through part of meiosis before a little female child is born. And then they kind of stop. So in this stage, they have kind of frozen in their development until puberty, and then the eggs will be fertilizable. So after this point, the eggs will continue maturing and probably be fertilizable, but they are present in the female baby even before birth. That's pretty cool. The other new terminology, maybe this is important terminology that we need here, is ovulation. What is that, ovulation? Yeah, the egg comes out of the ovary. Ovulation. I like how you said it. The ovary releases. We're going to add on one word, a mature. And we're going to use the word oocyte instead of egg. So ovulation is when the ovary releases an oocyte that has totally finished maturing. And they ought to be haploid with 23 chromosomes. So during the process, when the oocytes are developing and maturing in the ovary, they will be in this arrangement of cells surrounding them called follicles. So a follicle is like a development center for an oocyte. They're both round. Kind of like an egg in a nest, you can think of it. So there would be an oocyte surrounded by a follicle. And as the different oocytes are maturing, they get bigger. And the follicles also get bigger. So when oocytes and follicles are developing, you have many that start developing. But there are only a few finish developing. So you start with 200,000. The ones that finish developing ought to be 1 per menstrual cycle from puberty through menopause. So there are not that many oocytes during a woman's life that will actually finish developing. It's about once a month, one, from the time you go through puberty to the time you go through menopause. Many start, few finish. And what happens to the other ones is that basically they die. So they don't finish developing, they eventually die. And then as you get older, the ones that you have left also get older. If that makes sense. So when you look at this in an ovary on the microscope, it has a certain appearance. And I added in this slide that you all didn't have. I was reviewing through slides and I was looking for this, and I'm like, oh, why is that not there? We need this. So this is cross-section of an ovary, kind of like what you looked at last week. And an ovary looks different from a testis under the microscope because you've got circles of way different sizes. So there's a lot of small ones scattered around. There's some that are medium, and there's some that are really big. But they're all basically circles. Not like testis where all the circles are the same size and they're all look the same as each other. Ovary, you've got different size of follicles, and then on the inside, you've got the oocyte. So this would be follicle. This is oocyte. This is actually from a art, like purchased art images. It's very nice. It'd make a good like bathroom wallpaper. And then most people like don't know what it is, and it would be funny. Dorky. So this is a real picture of real ovulation. So here we've got ovary. This is the oocyte that's mature, and it is leaving the ovary. And what's this thing over here? Yeah, the fallopian tube. Isn't it? Wouldn't you like to have this, wouldn't this be good? Or this be good in, middle school health? I think so. I hadn't until I taught this class. And I went looking, I always go look, Google image. Oh, look at that. It's beautiful in a way. So now this is what ovulation is. This is the fallopian tube. You got oocyte, ovary. So the cartoons, well, let me let you write the words, and then we'll talk about the cartoon. So we got ovulation, we know, and then there's a couple of new words here, corpus luteum and the hormone progesterone. So we'll come back to that in a minute. But what you're looking at in the cartoons here are kind of a follicle during the maturation process. So they're not shown to scale here. This would actually be smaller than this, and they get bigger as they go. But this is the developmental process. So start to finish. And this would represent an oocyte that actually finished maturing and actually was released, and one of those select few that finished developing. And as the oocytes are developing in the follicle, they have these names: primordial, primary, secondary, tertiary. Ovulating is the bursting out. And then you've got this leftover follicle here. This is an empty follicle because the oocyte just left. And this left behind part of the follicle where the egg just came out of there, that's called corpus luteum. And corpus luteum cells sense that the oocyte has left, and that's a signal for this to start making progesterone. So right after ovulation, this corpus luteum starts making a hormone called progesterone, and that's going to become important later. So normally, you don't have progesterone all the time. You start making it right after ovulation, if you're female. So a lot going on this graph, a lot of hormone names. So I'm going to start at the top of the graph and look at the cartoon first. So we've got a pretty advanced follicle. It's tertiary, it's pretty big. The oocyte is pretty far along in developing. And that's eventually going to get released during ovulation, leaving behind that corpus luteum. If you got this picture, draw a line down to there. The corpus luteum, basically, as soon as it's right after ovulation, that's when you start to see progesterone rise. It's making this progesterone. And then the corpus luteum kind of degrades, and we see progesterone drops again. And then the process starts all over. So that's the cartoon part. Next thing to look at is this little axis that says day of menstrual cycle. And how many days does this say is a menstrual cycle? 28, that's the average. That's the average. Women can differ pretty dramatically on what's their cycle length, but this is assuming that someone's on a 28-day cycle. And what defines what day 0 is?
Day started.
Yeah, the day the menstrual period started. So that is referred to as day 0. And so this cycle ought to be repeating every 28 days or every 31 days or however long the individual female's cycle length is. So during a menstrual cycle or menstrual cycle, there are 4 hormones that are important. And these are called follicle stimulating, luteinizing, estrogen, and progesterone. And these graphs show when they're high and they show when they're low. And probably, like, this is not going to be super important unless you're going into nursing school. You'll need this graph eventually. You'll probably see it again there. But it's showing what are the 4 important hormones and when do they peak. And I want, if you've got these pictures, I want you to show, I want you to draw some stars, asterisks, on those 2 peaks. So there's estrogen peaks, and then right after that, what is that? Luteinizing hormone peaks. And then right after that, you have ovulation. So there's kind of a hormone cascade going on here. So this is how it goes. Estrogen, estrogen controls luteinizing hormone, and luteinizing hormone controls ovulation by the peaks of those 2 hormones. That becomes really important when we learn about how hormonal contraception works. It's basically leveling out the peaks of these so they don't really change, they just stay the same. So these different hormones, they have different effects, but the levels of estrogen and progesterone are also important in controlling oocyte development and also maintaining endometrial lining. So that's the uterine lining. These hormone levels control what's going on with your uterus lining. I think we got a separate graph that shows that coming up next. So these 4 hormones are supposed to be cycling in this pattern, and if they're not, it can become hard to get pregnant. Luteinizing hormone basically causes ovulation. So this vertical line where they're saying day 14 ovulation. Ovulation basically doesn't happen until luteinizing hormone is that high. Yeah. And here's again our picture of ovulation. I used to only have it here, and I decided I need to copy it back earlier too. Okay, so what we're gonna discuss next is, okay, you've ovulated if you're female. What's gonna happen next to the egg, and where does it go, and what are all these other structures for? This anatomy here. So once the oocyte is released, it's coming out of the ovary, and I don't know how. Like it's supposed to be 1 month one side, 1 month the other side. I don't know how that happens. It's cool, but it'll be one on one side and not both sides each cycle. So the egg oocyte would be released, and then it needs to start a traveling journey and start moving through this fallopian tube, which can also be called uterine tube, and make its way toward the uterus. And there are some cells in these uterine tubes that move by creating fluid currents. So the mechanism of how an egg moves is real different than the mechanism of how sperm moves. It's not muscle-based. It is a slow liquid current. These cells in the lining of the uterine tube kind of flapping in one direction. And it's pretty slow. So we'll look at in a bit, like how slow, how long does it take to get from here to the uterus? But that's how the oocyte will start moving toward the uterus. And I know something else I wanted to mention. A lot of times the diagrams show like the ovary is touching the fallopian tube. That's actually not. There's a space in between. So it's like there are these ciliated flapping cells in here, and they're just creating the slowest fluid suction. And the egg, the oocyte, is close. And if everything goes right, it will make its way into the fallopian tube or the uterine tube.
How far is the gap between the, and the?
It would be less than a centimeter and probably on the range of some number of millimeters. Like they should not be drastically far apart. If they were drastically far apart, the fluid current, it's strongest close to the fallopian tube. So if they were really far apart, it's going to be much more difficult for the oocyte to get in there. So I would say, this is not something I know, but my perception is it's millimeter range.
Why aren't they attached?
It's a good question. I think in some animals they are attached. I'm gonna ask Professor Rudd that later. He knows those kind of things. Attached would be more successful reproductively, but I don't know why they're not attached. Like I would make them, I would make them attached if I was designing. So as the oocyte is moving through the fallopian tube, normally it gets fertilized, if it's going to get fertilized by sperm. That's happening in the tube because it moves so slow. And if it gets fertilized, by the time it gets to the uterus, it will have physiological properties that allow it to attach. and it will attach to the uterine lining. There are some good places to attach, and there are some bad places to attach. So the places of most beneficial attachment are basically there. So most beneficial locations for implantation. Call it the attachment, or it's really like a burrowing of the fertilized egg into the uterine lining. It's best if that happens kind of higher up in the uterus. So up toward the top, not back in the tube, not too low. Those are the best places. And the other thing to note about this is wherever implantation happens, that will lead to development of the placenta. So the placenta, which develops between the embryo and the mother, the placenta will form at that spot, wherever implantation happened. The other major event that happens with implantation is progesterone hormone. So we already had some progesterone hormone starting during ovulation because the corpus luteus was making it, but after implantation, there's even more. And now the level is very high. And the level of progesterone is very high constantly. Constantly, it's going to stay high as long as the pregnancy persists. Final thing, this concept has a lot that goes with it. Final thing, let's do red box. Implantation, when it happens, is how we define pregnancy. And I'll get back to why that is in a few minutes, but we say that someone's pregnant when we can tell that they're pregnant, and we can't tell that they're pregnant until implantation. So medically, pregnancy means implantation. A super, super, super important fact to know. And when you have implantation, you're going to have constant high level of progesterone for as long as the pregnancy continues. Yes, great. This is the next slide we need. So all of this is super important stuff. I'm gonna make sure everybody's got this before we go on. Did any of you learn this before? Where'd you learn it before?
CCNA testing.
Okay. Was that part of your high school program or something separate?
It's like a CCMA, it's a medical assistant,
Mm-hmm.
and I have like a specialty
Mm-hmm.
in this, if I took extra classes.
Yeah, okay. So it wasn't normal
No.
high school. Okay, yeah. It's this pretty complicated stuff because until you don't, if you don't know what a hormone is, like how do you? Yeah, but helpful. Hey, oh, good. Thank you so much.
This is one nice, her name is on it.
Okay, thank you. I hadn't been thinking about that yet. Okay, good stuff, important stuff. Now we've got a new version of the hormones graph with a few new details. Okay, some of that I already mentioned. When we switched to OpenStax, I completely redid, like much more dramatically, this whole unit. So sometimes I don't remember the order of what I'm gonna say when. So we don't need to focus on this part, but more of the top and then the cartoons. So make a note on this page right here that this person that is displaying this pattern, that would be a female, is not pregnant. This is the not pregnant situation. Probably some drawing on it. This is the situation when there is no pregnancy because the oocyte was not fertilized or because the oocyte did not implant. And notice, okay, here's progesterone, and then progesterone goes back down. Okay, so draw a line from progesterone. And like, you could keep going up. And put a note there that if the person is pregnant, they will keep on making progesterone and it'll get really high and it won't go back down. But this is referencing what if the person is not pregnant. So if the person is not pregnant and progesterone drops, and then that drop right here that low progesterone signals for causing the endometrium to shed or be released, and menstrual period will start at that point. The progesterone drop controls that. So low progesterone causes lining to shed, and then cycle starts over. If progesterone does not drop, the lining will not shed, and the period will not start. So hormones are controlling that. So we're kind of gonna leave the pregnant, not pregnant topic right now and talk about some more anatomy, the female reproductive system. Past the uterus, let's say, or below the uterus. All that concept that the cord is magnetic. That's such a safety that I hate to do. You're fine. If we all the study for lab and stuff. Okay, so we've got on this diagram a side view, or what we call a sagittal section of the female reproductive system, looking from the person's left. So here's the uterus. The ovary is actually kind of out to the side over here, but they're drawing it here. Here's vagina. Here's the bladder. And this is the front of the person. So it's always good when you're working with the models, like, okay, which way is up? Which way is the front? Which way is the back? Is this a male or female? And showing some detail about the entrance or the exit to the uterus. So for this area called cervix, what cervix is kind of reaching down of the uterus into the vagina. So if this would be a front view. Uterus here, vagina here. There's a section that kind of bulges in to the vagina. It's called cervix. And cervix, I feel like is the most important female reproductive structure that people have never heard of. But it's just the low part of the uterus connecting to the vagina. And there is always, almost always, some level of membrane over it. Kind of like the strong kind of plastic wrap. About that consistency. That is covering over the cervix, which is called hymen. Hymen. So hymen has enough opening to let menstrual blood out, but tends to cover the cervix. And a lot of times the first time that someone has sex, that might tear, but it might not tear. It might bleed, but it might not bleed. And certain societies use hymen checks, used to be more prevalent in the olden days, to like check for virginity. It's not reliable. It's be the kind of thing where like, well, yeah, 85% of virgins would have an intact hymen, but it's not reliable. So a few years ago, some like public musician person was tweeting about his daughter's hymen. Do you remember this? I was like, whoa, hymen never enters the public vocabulary ever. And then I thought, that poor girl. Anyway, I'm always intrigued when a word that nobody knows biologically like suddenly shows up in the public conversation. Hymen is that way. Yeah, it is unethical. It's very. So clarifying, what is unethical is to like talk about your daughter's hymen like that on Twitter or whatever it was. So hymen can, when it's there, can let menstrual blood out. It also, if it's not sworn, could let some sperm in, which we'll talk about that later. It's over the cervix. The other thing to note about cervix is it is not controllable. So we have sphincters for urine. We have sphincters for feces, but there is no sphincter to control menstrual blood coming out of the uterus. And this is a thing that's really important to know, and women would naturally know this, like you can't hold it in, but some men don't know this. So there's nothing really hold it in. It's not controllable. Older men especially tend to not know that. See if I. Also, cervix becomes super important during labor and delivery. Learn about that next week. This picture is, everyone needs to know this. Whether you are male or female, whether you are heterosexual, homosexual, all people need to know this information. And I want to, while y'all are writing the words, kind of circle on here the structures that will be on lab exam. Not everything down here, but certain. So this really, everyone probably knows that already. Those three. And these, when I teach, I'm not setting up the lab exam this time, but when I teach lab exam, I always have this diagram somewhere in the room with certain stuff on it. And some of this is, actually all of this is also on the lab model. So very important to know what is the order from front to back. So in the front, there is clitoris. Its technical name is glans clitoris, and it basically has similar structures to it as male penis. So there is corpus cavernosum extending from it. It's just slightly different structure. So you have clitoris in the front, then you have urethra, then vagina, then anus. This is supposed to say anus for the back. So front to back. 4 important external structures: clitoris, urethral opening, vaginal opening, anus. And then the other 2 maybe new things on this are the labia or the skin folds. So labia kind of enclose this area, and there's an internal one called labia minora, actually 2. Outer one's called labia majora. And all of this together is called vulva. So vulva is basically the group of outside structures. Good terms to know. I saw this meme last week that relates to this. It was kind of concerning, but also kind of funny. Oh, I know what it was. It was something like a question in the meme or something. Can girls pee when they have a tampon in? The answer is yes. No, I mean, yes. And one year, the favorite thing I ever got on these little cards, that somebody wrote on a little card and left it for me, and it said, can you please tell everyone that girls do not pee out of their vagina? Yeah, I'll tell everyone that every year. There's separate openings, but like for males, their reproductive and their urine fluids do come out of the same opening. So for guys that have never really been taught this well, that's how they work. If they had the equivalent of a tampon, it would block their urine. So separate, this is very important for everyone to know. And for my sons, at some point, I will go through this with them because
Say at some point.
I gotta do it pretty soon.
How many kids are born?
16,
16.
yeah, 16-year-old, 12 and 10.
Dr. John. I think the 16-year-old is supposed to be already.
I'm putting it off. I mean, it's awkward.
You can always watch cooking shows.
Yeah.
Never gonna be there. Imagine telling your kids about a struggle. With a cooking show. How do you come back from it?
I don't know. Better to tell them than not tell them.
Or than I tell my children.
Yeah.
And go cooking show. I'm like, you really have a 16-year-old child?
Yes.
That's really shocking.
He doesn't come around here as much anymore. He can drive. He's got long hair.
I really thought you only had the 2 small ones.
So you see them more. Yeah.
Never gonna get you 16.
I'll take that as a compliment. I was 26 when I had it. This is showing lateral view again. It's the same diagram. Clitoris in the front, urethral opening next, vaginal opening next, anus next. And I guess the point of this slide is to show where's the uterus and where's the bladder. And the urethra is short. Oh, we could do, there's a good drawing. So this is urethra. Remember, it's about 4 centimeters. Pretty short. And generally, in this region, there are going to be bacteria. And it's easier for bacteria to swim up to the bladder for 4 centimeters in a woman than it is 20 in a man. It's a short distance. This is also why for females, it's really important to wipe front to back. Away from the urethra. So that's why why we do that. And this is also why women get higher rate of UTIs. Okay, so that kind of ends the anatomy. And the way that I test anatomy in lecture is not to ask you what is this called? Because that's a lab thing. So by the time you have this lecture exam, I think you'll know what all these are called. But what I do on the exam is I use these two diagrams and I print it in color. This front back, these two. And each of the structures is going to have a letter in it. So like this might be letter R for the testis, and this might be letter B for the fallopian tube. And all the different structures have a letter associated. And then you have, excuse me, you have a list of descriptions. And their function descriptions. And you tell me which letter, which thing does that? Which thing does that? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And but it was talking about how like girls will be having like they'll have like, or I think it was yeast. Might have been yeast, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't remember what it was exactly, but it was talking about how guys will give their girlfriend like
Yeast infections?
something like that.
Yeah. Can. Yeah, so the bacteria that I had been mentioning on here will like be already on the female. But anything on male reproductive tract can also introduce microbes to females. Yeah. And it's not always the ones we consider STD, but also just kind of the pushing from out to in can help move her microbes in as well. I'm so proud of myself. I answered that question. You should have seen me when I was new at this. I would get so embarrassed. Experience, practice help. So that question on lab exam, it's gonna have, it's like a 20-point question. It's like a fourth of the 20 thing. And it's gonna include things that we've already talked about, but it also includes stuff during pregnancy and contraception and stuff like that. So it's not to name the thing, it's to match what it does. Yeah. Match with what it does. So that's a different type of question, but I like that type of question because knowing the name is good and that's a start, but knowing what it does is also very important. Okay, gotta switch slide sets now. So this next part, now that we know the anatomy, we are now going to focus on basically conception and the development of the fetus. So all these sections will just kind of merge into each other. And this is a picture of oocyte or the egg in red, and then there are multiple sperm that have made that trip and reached where the egg is and are trying to fertilize it. Your quiz questions for today. They all say number one, but I think they go in order. I think that one about the small pizza, I'll like keep an eye on that because I don't know if OpenStack, I bet OpenStax doesn't phrase it that way, but you got it wrong. I don't remember what the other answers were. So we've looked at what a sperm really looks like, and we know a lot now about what the different parts do. This is a very old drawing from 1694 of, and it has the shape of a sperm, but this is how people used to think about sperm until we had, this is before microscopes, basically. So they knew the shape. That's pretty impressive. Maybe they had a big magnifying glass or something. They knew the shape, and it was thought that the sperm had everything. It even has a little person in there. The man is forming the little person in the sperm and it just goes into the female and she's an incubator. So that concept is called homunculus, this little mini person. Is known as homunculus, and it's not real. It's what people thought was real in those days. So the sperm are important, but also the egg is important. And you need both of them contributing basically equally to make a new person eventually. So part of that process is normally going to start with sperm deposited in the vagina, and the sperm should be swimming up through the cervix. And they're going to go through the cervix, swim through the uterus, and they will actually swim to the fallopian tube. They have a very long way to go. And they go into the fallopian tube or the uterine tube, and that's where they tend to fertilize the oocyte. So fertilization takes place in the uterine tube. That's worth writing down. Very important fact. Fertilization normally happens in the uterine tube. And the sperm are kind of following chemical signals to know where to go. And it's a long way. And they have to swim properly and they have to have enough fuel and all of that. So normally, hopefully, several sperm will reach the egg, but only one of them actually fertilizes successfully. So that, in this case, that would be this one. So this one is the winner. Whichever one goes through the wall of the egg first is going to do the fertilization. And then the egg really quickly goes through this shutdown process to harden this outer membrane so it doesn't get multiply fertilized. So this sperm is going to have 23 chromosomes, and the egg is going to have 23 chromosomes also. And as soon as those chromosomes join together, we form something called zygote. So when fertilization happens, produce zygote. And the zygote now has 46 chromosomes. And because it's got combined chromosomes from sperm and egg, the zygote is genetically different than the sperm, and it's genetically different than the egg. So it can be the start of a new person if everything goes right. But we call that zygote. So that's a very important vocab word, zygote. And after the zygote forms, so this is kind of weird. They're starting like, this is before, after. You have fertilization. The nuclei have to get close together, join their chromosomes, and then it's zygote. And from the point when the zygote forms, it will do two things quite quickly. So once the zygote forms, it's now going to take this path. So I've kind of put together two figures here. The zygote will, number one, float and drift toward the uterus, and it's still getting flapped by those ciliated cells, so it's drifting slowly. And number two, it will divide. So it will divide multiple times pretty quickly. So in a way, it's kind of dividing faster than it flows. So the one cell becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8, 16, and so on. And these have some different names of their stages, but the one to know is blastocyst. Blastocyst. So by the time the zygote has divided enough times to have this many cells to become the blastocyst, blastocysts tends to be what implants. Because the zygote is dividing faster than it drifts. And by the time it gets to the uterus, a place where it can implant, it's normally at this stage called blastocyst. Before we leave this, there is another terminology that we use for all of these stages. So all of this occurs within the stage that we call this embryo. So embryo, that's a real broad term, and it includes anything from zygote up through fetus, which is several weeks away during pregnancy. Really close in the semester. So learn about it. Yeah, that's a good time to stop. So Monday we'll continue on with this. There might be a new slide set that you might need. There's a quiz. You should study for lab exam over the weekend. And remember, I'll be there this afternoon, 1:45 to 3. Sunday about 2 to 3, and then Monday afternoon. I don't know, like I need to check